Okay, Vicki.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Monday morning. Again, I'd like to remind everyone to any questions that you have through Rob's presentation, just use the chat feature to submit them, and Dr. Eiler will take the questions and provide your answers at the end of the session. Dr. Eiler, it is yours.
Thank you, Vicki. And I want to thank Kshaped, Concepts, and Kaiser Marston for sponsoring this series. And thank you all for making the time on a Monday to come and hear some more about the economy from me. If it's the first time, thank you for coming. And hopefully you're going to get something out of this that might help you plan for 2021. Let's get started. Let me tell you, here's the basic overview from the September data. The October data for the US are going to come out right before Election Day, or right after Election Day, I'm sorry. So it'll be very intriguing to see how all that starts to play out. But the US is now down to 7.9% unemployment, but there's still 10.7 million people out of a job since 12 months ago. California's down to 11% seasonally adjusted unemployment, with about 2.08 million people out of work since September 2019. And you can see real quick on a ratio basis there, that's about 20% of the US total. And we're still watching continued claims, and I'll show you some data that are encouraging for both the US and California, but we're also watching the conversion of permanent layoff or to permanent layoffs from temporary layoffs. And I'll show you those data in just a second as well. And that's where economists are starting to get concerned about the duration of recovery. And the presidential election race has brought up another letter in the alphabet soup of recovery, which is a K-shaped recovery. And I'm going to show you a little bit of data to suggest that we are in what you can think of as a K-shaped recovery, meaning that high wage jobs are recovering more quickly than low and middle wage jobs. And that kind of depends on where you are in the economy. But for California, that certainly is true for right now. How long that lasts is unknown. We will see. But it does suggest how job losses have happened. And if there's structural change, that's the real worry. And then we'll also talk about how the forecasts are making adjustments based on that kind of recovery, but also based on how the presidential election results and the caseloads are starting to evolve. And with that, historically speaking, election results don't have much of a change on the medium term. They can lead to a little bit of short-term volatility. You may remember when Trump was elected in 2016, our equity markets reacted very well to that initially. And that's one of his biggest claims to fame, is that he's really driven equity prices up and kept them there even through the coronavirus issues. But in the truer, longer term sense, and thinking historically, presidential elections generally do not have that large an effect on the economy and its trajectory in the short term. It's more of a medium and long term thing, depending on how tax laws change, spending changes, and really our overall reaction to issues in the economy and ultimately the political outcome. We will see how public resources flow, and that's another big piece of how Congress is looking at providing a new package, trying to stimulate jobs and lift them up in specific industries, but also potentially provide for municipalities that have started to see more and more concerns. Well, folks, I'm going to start with the potentially good news, and that is recession is likely to be declared over either in Q3 or Q4, but maybe there'll be an announcement this quarter that it's basically over. But that really is a technical thing, in the sense that if you look at the technical aspects of how recession is defined, it likely will be declared over and be one of the shorter recessions we've had in the post-war period. The problem is if you don't have a job or your business is lost, it's going to feel like a recession for quite a while. And now we're in this recovery phase, and whether or not we get a short recovery or long recovery is still an open question. A lot of the seeds of a medium-term recovery, meaning that we should not recover completely as where we were before coronavirus hit and our economy shrunk based on social constraints by 2022 or 2023. And I'll show you some of the forecasts along those lines in just a second. But one of the reasons why we think that that's true, in other words, there may be more of a medium-term recovery, are these data. These are the way that people become unemployed. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics and labor economists generally bucket the unemployed into 6 different categories. First is temporary layoffs. I'm going to stop here, and I'm showing you this first because we've seen a historic change in the number of temporary layoffs as we've entered recession, vis-a-vis the Great Recession for sure. But just thinking back in time, I'm going to show you what a normal big recession looks like, looking at the Great Recession as an example. But generally speaking, recessions are typified by having permanent job losses, meaning that you lose your job and you're not really expected to go back to the same employer. A temporary layoff is when your employer says, hey, we're going to shut the faucet off for a couple of months and we're going to bring you back. And this recession, as you can see on the far right-hand side, that spike suggests that the initial surge in unemployment was basically a temporary layoff issue. But as time has worn on, you'll see now that blue is appearing, and you can see now the hill that was created on the far left-hand side, that is the Great Recession. And the surge in job losses in the Great Recession was primarily based on permanent job losses. And then there's other ways people become unemployed, meaning you had a temporary job that ended, you left your job or you quit, you re-entering the labor force, but you don't have a job yet when you were out of the labor force before. And you can see that when recovery begins, if you look at the Great Recession, that lighter blue area gets a little bit bigger as job recovery starts up. And then there's new entrants, meaning generally speaking, college students that have graduated and also high school students that have graduated. Now, let's go back to the far right-hand side. And let me go back a little bit. Whoop, I almost gave away the farm there. This is where we started. Okay, this is where we are today. Now notice it's much more of a rainbow effect rather than dominated by the gray area of temporary job losses. So as temporary job losses have been changed over, some of them have become permanent job losses, that darker blue, and some of them have become hiring back, which we've seen in the jobs numbers we just talked about. So this is where we are today in terms of remaining temporary job losses, or I shouldn't say that, as of the end of September. But this is the additional on top of the temporary job losses that provide the remaining number of people that are out of work. And the bigger that darker blue becomes, the more worrisome a short-term recovery becomes in the terms of it's more likely to be more of a medium-term recovery as more permanent job losses arise. Looking across the states, September 2020, the US 7.9%, again, seasonally adjusted. New York, still 9.7, pretty close to 10. Illinois, a little over 10, California at 11. So those more populous states are much different than what's happening in some of the Midwest states, where Nebraska is actually down to 3.5% unemployment, South Dakota at 4.1, Vermont at 4.2, which is kind of an anomaly in New England, and Nevada's at 12.6, which is one of the highest out there. Hawaii is actually the highest at 15 of all the states, but that makes sense given the tourism season and most of Hawaii's economy being on lockdown still in terms of the flow of people on and off the islands. But these do not count the self-employed or part-time workers, but if you look at the map, the darker states are the ones that are still at relatively high unemployment. The lighter states are the ones that have had fewer cases, have opened up their economy more completely, and are seeing more job creation. But if I showed you the most current coronavirus map, it would almost flip-flop that picture. And so it's been very intriguing to think about what's going to happen over the next few months and a lot of the politics about reopening the economy and ultimately getting jobs back. Well, I talked off the top about continued unemployment insurance claims. And so one of the things we've been watching as economists is not so much the new claimants that are gaining access to unemployment insurance, but the ones that are still on there. And these are the total weeks that the unemployment insurance fund is paying on a weekly basis, looking forward from January this year to about 2 weeks ago. This is the fade in the US. So the total number of weeks paid on unemployment peaked in early May, which suggests a very quick bounce up and then started to slide down. And this is one of the reasons why we've heard a lot about a so-called V-shaped recovery, but notice that the second leg of that V has been very flat. And we're still at about 8 million people or 8 million weeks being paid on a weekly basis on unemployment insurance, which again, if you look back at the graph we just showed, this is a subset of the folks that are unemployed. Here's California. And California, after kind of a wild summer, has been starting now suddenly to fade in September, which is good. We want these data to go down. But California, notice, for months has been relatively flat. And that's why the unemployment rate is still relatively high in California. And what we haven't seen a whole lot of consistent movement yet. But folks, this is such a fast recession. We're really only in month 6 of this issue. And if you think about the last recession, which was very large, it took a long time for us to go from the beginning to the bottom and then into recovery. We're already recovering. That's why I said that we're likely to have recession declared over, but we need these numbers to continue to fade down at a little faster pace if we want to have a quicker recovery. That's why I'm suggesting it might be more of a medium-term recovery, because we're not seeing as much give back on these jobs. And as those permanent job losses start to rack up, it's less likely that folks are going to be coming off of unemployment insurance anytime soon. Now, a lot also depends on how the congressional package allows an extension of benefits and allows people to, in a sense, linger on unemployment for a longer period of time, where they may be on the margin choosing not to necessarily go back in the labor or go back and take a job because the benefits are higher than what the wage they would be paid would be otherwise. Now, taking all that into consideration, let's look at some of the US forecasts. The IMF about 10 days ago came out with their forecast for the US and for every country in the world. And this is what they're looking on the annual side through 2023. Negative year this year, negative 4.5, which is actually up from their last quarter estimate of the next few years, but then relatively moderate growth and very similar to the Federal Reserve branches, in the sense that overall, all 12 branches of the Federal Reserve do forecast for the US economy. The range over the next couple quarters is all over the place, but overall for the year, they're pretty much the same as the IMF, and over the next few years, very similar also. And economists sort of looking forward and saying that we're watching very closely to see if we have any problems over the next few months that would upset those forecasts, but we're likely to see relatively moderate growth, assuming recovery continues to be smooth. The reason we're likely to see more and more recovery action is because we have monetary and fiscal policy working together. So the congressional package that's being discussed is going to be another stack on top of the original huge package called the CARES Act that was accommodating reduced interest rates. And all that stuff is very similar to what we saw at the end of 2009 after Obama was elected, and we had this huge package called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money, ARRA, which you may remember. All that is now ready to go and, in a sense, juice recovery. But we have to have our economy open back up again to really feel the full effects of that on both the credit market and also through fiscal policy. Now, if you look at some regional data in California, just to kind of get a sense now of shifting from the national picture to the state and maybe the more local for you, here's the unemployment rate at different places. LA is still very deep in recession in terms of the labor market, about 15.1% unemployment, still about 733,000 people out of work as of the end of September that had a job the previous September. But one of the anomalies in this, as you see, the other unemployment rates in other parts of California have slipped below 10, is the loss of the labor force. Now, losing labor force is a typical aspect of recession, meaning that people basically get discouraged with the labor market and walk out of the labor market for a little while and perhaps pursue a business venture. And that's why you have to take some of the labor data with a grain of salt, because it doesn't necessarily count those that are employed or self-employed or are part-time completely. But these data suggest that we're still lingering around loss of labor force, which is also potentially a loss of productivity. And if that's true, the capacity of the economy to generate the same gains we had before coronavirus is still in question, which means we're still swimming through the end of a recession and the beginnings of recovery. So we will watch these very closely going forward. We need the labor force numbers to get closer to zero in terms of percentage change, and we need that unemployment rate to keep slipping down. Until that happens, we're going to be in California at least lingering around sort of similar, relatively high unemployment and slow jobs growth numbers. Now, one thing that we have also thought about is, are there specific groups that are being more affected by unemployment? And these are data I just received from EDD, because they're finally starting to publish these data after a few months. Here's unemployment insurance claims by age. And so this is 16 to 19, those are those. So teenagers losing their job and asking for unemployment insurance. 20 to 24, 25 to 34. So you can see there's a real spike here, and there's a consistent spike over time. And a lot of this is because 25 to 34-year-old workers are typically in services jobs, and that is where the preponderance of job loss not only happened, but also remains out of work. 35 to 44, 45 to 54, this is usually getting now into the bulk of professional services and other things like construction and manufacturing. And then you're getting into the more senior ages of 55 and over, and then 65 to 85. Now you can see that those losses have picked up a little bit on the far right-hand side. And some of that's also because the older workers working in services are now starting to feel the effects of remaining in a closed economy in California. The other group is called PUA, or Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Claims. And this is stacked on. This is part of the CARES Act and ultimately part of the state of California's additional. That didn't start until May, but very similar moves. And you can see that by age. In this case, though, because it also included those that were self-employed, the age range moved out away from the 25 to 34 range and the spikes were in a bit older age ranges. But these data suggest, however, that the younger age workers were the ones that lost jobs first, and the older age workers, or at least let's say like the 45 to 60 range, are ones that started to lose businesses or potentially lost their side hustles. And those data are still lingering with us in terms of job losses in California. Now, the job changes, if you look at the industries, and this is basically going to follow what I just said, this is from April to September. So notice on the far right-hand side, leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, hotels, real low initially, other services, an amalgam of hair salons, nail salons, auto shops, Nonprofit organizations that aren't related to healthcare lost jobs very quickly. Even information in tech, we saw an initial surge down. And then we saw some climb back up as we went into summer. And it's kind of stayed relatively consistent since summer started. And if you go back to those unemployment insurance claims, it's just in September where we feel like we're starting to get around some of the issues in terms of getting our economy slowly back open in full. But if you, again, you look to the right-hand side, that 29% suggests that about 3 out of 10 people that had a job last September in leisure and hospitality do not have their job now. 3 out of 10 workers, and other services is not that far behind. And that's hanging around the neck of places like Los Angeles County. And why Los Angeles is still at relatively high unemployment is because services that they have relative risk exposure in, those services on the far right-hand side, remain closed. Now, I'm going to show you real quick across a bunch of different places and show you some summary data. This is the change in non-farm jobs going from the sort of lowest metropolitan statistical area, which at this stage is San Luis Obispo County, in terms of having the largest non-farm job loss, looking September to September, meaning looking back 1 year from September 2020, and how many people are out of work that had a job 1 year ago, moving up all the way toward Tulare County, which is on the far right-hand side. So this picture does not really suggest any geographic change or let's say characteristic that suggests urban versus suburban versus rural in this sense. Now, if you look at what we're going to now call cumulative gains, this is what's happened since we've hit bottom, assuming we've hit bottom. And you can see that for a lot of these areas, there have been some gains. So while there are still job losses, almost every place in California, every major metropolitan statistical area has seen some gains since the bottom, and hence there's been some recovery. The black columns are actually maybe more indicative of where recovery has the largest momentum. So think about that and where you live, and think about where the jobs are still lower, but that you're seeing some growth. And there's some trade-offs there in the sense that some of these places are a little bit smaller, thus getting percentage gains that are relatively high, a little easier. Okay, so that's kind of the roundup on jobs. Let's look at housing. On housing, this is a good thing if it holds, meaning that Zillow and most housing forecasters out there are seeing positive growth for the next year in percentage change in median home price growth. Why? Because they're not expecting a huge number of new units to come online in the next year. And with low interest rates and relatively decent recovery in higher wage earning workers, those that may be renting right now will now see an amazing deal out there in buying a home and finally moving out of rental into a home that now is more affordable for them given lower interest rates and also available. You may remember, even though it seems like 100 million years ago, that we were talking about housing crisis and a lack of availability and a lack of affordability. Well, the availability side may start to shake loose a little bit as people remain out of work or are concerned about their job over the long term and want to get out of their local area and put their house up for sale. Demand should be there. And if you notice, if these data hold, that means demand is really going to be there and things are looking good for homeowners. The problem is the affordability piece. If this holds, while it is true that it preserves homeowner wealth, it also separates even more fully the lower and middle income workers from moving into a home at an affordable price because prices are still going to be rising. Recessions are usually typified by having lower housing prices because people abandon their homes, concerned about people selling their homes, and there's some increase in supply, which drives home prices down. Demand then reacts as the economy starts to recover, and housing prices slowly inch back up again. If you go back in the last few recessions, that's exactly what happened. This one's been a little weirder because the speed at which monetary policy lowered interest rates and provided better demand conditions was almost right on top of the beginning of the recession, which is also very atypical. So we will see if these housing prices hold. I talked earlier about a K-shaped recovery. Well, this graph, in a sense, typifies what you're seeing in the presidential debates and also just in the presidential rhetoric on both sides about the recovery. The Trump administration is seeing recovery more in the red, where the Biden administration or Biden campaign is looking more at the split between the lower wages and the higher wages. Notice what these data are for California as of the beginning of September. About 3.5% high wage jobs lost since the beginning of January, but about 28 in low wage jobs, meaning under $27,000 a year versus above $60,000 a year on the highway side. And the middle wages have picked back up again, where originally in terms of the beginning of summer, there was a real complete split between all three camps. But we will see how these goes. But that split is the essence of a K-shaped recovery in the sense that it looks like the higher wage and even to a certain extent the middle wage jobs are recovering more quickly than the low. Now, another piece is small businesses. This suggests that small businesses, meaning those that are basically under 25 workers or less, are still about 30% closed in California. And in leisure and hospitality, it's about 42% closed as of the end of September 29. Notice that originally, as we were going into summer, things were picking back up. And that's because our economy was starting to open up some more, and businesses that were originally closed based on the social constraints imposed by the governor's office and ultimately by local counties and cities started to be released. But then we went back in the beginning of September with a second wave. And if you look at this, this almost tracks the waves of coronavirus cases in California. You can see it's starting to inch back up again. We will see if we have a surge in California, if it doesn't slide back down again. We want these data to start moving back up towards zero very quickly. But here's something I want to start to leave you with. One of the things we're watching closely is structural threats. So as these small businesses remain closed, what does that mean for small businesses? Well, retail, big structural threat, especially in our malls, but also in our downtowns. Restaurants, especially those on the high end, because the high end are not necessarily going to be able to switch to a takeout model as much as, let's say, the lower end restaurants whose meals are maybe around $10 to $15 each, high end being 35 and up. Will you be willing to pay $200 for two people to eat takeout? Right, that's a big question for a lot of restaurants that put themselves in relatively high end areas. We will see if that ends up being a structural threat and those restaurants are lost in the short to medium term. Entertainment, your theaters, will they survive the fall and winter if we still cannot gather in places where people are reticent to go to the theater? Personal services, we will see how the cases change, but are we going to be able to have our haircuts, nails, and all those other services where people are relatively close to each other in terms of providing for clients? We will see. Education, will we be able to keep our teachers going? Are we going to be able to switch more to a long-term hybrid model in which we won't need as many teachers? And higher education is certainly concerned about this. And then government. We expect government to have a pretty tough year or so, and is that going to change the number of people working in government and ultimately providing services? Well, folks, I usually do a quick economic or workforce development take at the end of these, and I want to go through an idea called trust. And as an economist, this is getting very close to the end of my pay grade, but it's something to think about in terms of businesses reopening. Will you go back to the movies at the same pace? Will you go to a concert the same way? Will you eat out the same way? Will you travel the same way? Will you have family over the same way? You may have been hearing a lot of things now about Thanksgiving and getting a presidential opinion about whether or not people should gather for Thanksgiving, which is just kind of mind-boggling. Will you visit cities in the same way? Now, if you change your answer and say from yes to no, because cases are rising, that changes the flow of our economy and our ability to keep businesses open. How will office spaces work? How will daycare work? How will downtowns work? And folks, a lot of this boils down to trust. Do you trust interactions with people in very proximate ways that are going to change the way we do business? And that affects the economy by slowing things down and shifting costs. And we're already planning for this. And so we should expect that if cases rise, at the end of the day, businesses will make adjustments. There's a McKinsey report came out and said that they're expecting 85% of businesses to be back in the office by the end of this year, which to me is a mind boggler. But let's say that that happens. Will people come back in the same way? And will it change productivity when they go back because they're concerned about trusting the person in the next cubicle over? So what are we going to watch as we close in on 2021? Well, same thing we've been watching since the start. Watching unemployment insurance claims, but those continued claims, are those going to continue to trend down if cases on the coronavirus side start to go up? Are there going to be business losses that are going to lead to structural changes in certain industries? Retail and restaurant are the two big ones. Hotels not that far behind, and other travel related industries are very close. As the fall and winter evolves, are we going to see that there's going to be changes in the social constraints, and are we going to have to go back to a shelter in place? Most economists don't see that happening. They see enough adjustments and enough social distancing, and we're all kind of, in a sense, adapting to the new environment. But we're going to watch closely if that starts to affect job losses again, and if that is something that then starts to affect housing markets. We're also hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence about the move from urban to suburban, or even rural. And if that trend continues, I think some of that is going to definitely depend on if we see another surge in cases, and cities are the centerpiece of that surge. From a policy standpoint, we're waiting for the next fiscal package and what its components will be. We're also going to hear today probably that we have another Supreme Court justice, which might also change the way markets look at things going forward. But really at the end of the day, folks, on the policy side, what more can be done? We're at the lowest interest rates possible. We've had huge fiscal spending. One of the things to watch for is the components of the new, or are the components of the new package coming out of Congress, and whether or not it's more about investment or transfer payments to home. So we will see how that plays out in the short and long term. And also the election results are going to keep everybody kind of focused on the TV and with the political drama going on. But with that, I'm going to now take some questions. Vicki, thanks for hosting, and thank you all again for coming.
Okay, thank you, Rob. We have a couple questions here. Let me get back to them. Okay, Deborah asks, if you could elaborate on the information on the COVID and the map and jobs. And I think that was early on where you...
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
So if you look at the Midwest map, we're seeing relatively low unemployment rates in the Midwest. And at the same time, we're also hearing that coronavirus cases are rising more quickly in those areas. But what they're doing, which may be a model for how we're going to slowly get through the fall and winter, is they're not necessarily restricting economic movement. They're asking people to engage in social distancing, not every case wearing masks, but really trying to continue to have your economic life as they've opened up. And we will see if they're going to be forced based on the healthcare situation to close. But for right now, they seem to be slowly navigating through this. And this is one of the big things that the Trump campaign / administration is touting, is that the Midwest seems to be dealing with rising cases relatively well, which is maybe a model for the rest of the country. We will see. But if you took the map I showed you and you layered over corona cases, the coronavirus cases are rising in the same place that have relatively low unemployment, which suggests that potentially the economic interactions are leading to higher cases.
Thank you. Kathy Garcia asks, up in our region up here in Northern California, she is worried that businesses will close or switch gears because they can't find workers. No one in the area is applying for jobs.
Yeah, and so one of the things you should be concerned about is, especially in rural areas that already have relatively small labor forces, is if people are suddenly on the move, or people are concerned that they're not going back to work, they're going to lose out on benefits, or that going back to work is just not the right job for them. There's a lot of concern in smaller places that we're just not going to be able to find workers. Now, again, it's possible that as you can't find workers, wages will go up and attract people back in the labor force. But it is intriguing if that phenomenon is happening, that while businesses are looking for workers, it's getting tougher and tougher to find. That almost flips everything on its head, that demand is actually rising rather than having relatively high supply. We'll see if that phenomenon continues, but the supposition is some of that's probably driven by unemployment insurance benefits.
Okay. Isabel asks, recent, interesting that there was not a lag by age group, but I think this was the unemployment by age. And if I could tag on to that, it seemed that the loss of jobs by age didn't really equate to seniority.
Correct.
You would think that those that were last hired would be first fired or laid off. It didn't seem to be that was the case.
That's correct. But a lot of it, Vicki, was actually a function of the types of jobs that were lost and what the age group is predominantly in those jobs. So if you look at services jobs, they're predominantly younger workers, and that's why you saw such a surge in losses. It basically follows the services jobs losses. So the lag, there really was not a lag at all. It basically just hit all at once. And that's what was so atypical about this recession, is there were so many temporary job losses immediately in services jobs, in the sense that we have a restaurant, we're going to turn off the valve for a couple of months and we're going to hope to bring you back. And PPP lending helped allow some of that to happen in the short term. And then we saw another increase in the midsummer because the PPP money generally ran out, and you may have had some people who lost their job more permanently. And part of that is the twist we saw on that graph as well, moving from temporary to permanent job loss.
Okay. Don Burris asks, what does the analysis say about travel and tourism?
It suggests that we're going to have a pretty strange 2021 unless we make a social adjustment and we have vaccines come in full and people are going to trust travel. So the data don't really tell you much, except for the fact that with higher unemployment, people may be more reticent to travel, especially if they have the second layer of not knowing how travel will go for them from a healthcare standpoint. So we should expect that that's going to be an issue. And then that bleeds into having some problems with respect to city and county budgets, with respect to TOT and sales taxes rising, you should expect another couple of tough years in the public sector with respect to revenue.
Okay. And from Zach, any thoughts on how city and county tax revenue will be impacted next year?
It's going to be a tough year. So you should expect 2021, 2022 fiscal year to be down, but rising against 2020, 2021. How much is going to really depend on how we get through this fall and winter and whether or not we make enough adjustments and see a vaccine coming to start cleaning up some of the trust issues in terms of people going back to work, traveling, and consuming per normal, if you will, quote unquote, assuming we go back to something that looks like pre-COVID.
Okay. Kathy asks, is there any indication of any new manufacturing being proposed for healthcare in the regions around the country?
There certainly are some in the regions around the country, and both presidential candidates are touting the idea of increasing manufacturing jobs and also preparing for another healthcare crisis through that manufacturing. But we will see whether or not they're willing to make some partial investment on that, or the economics of bringing those jobs home actually work in reality.
Okay.
Vicki, I think we're at time.
We're at time? Okay. You want to take one more question from Don Burrows. He asks to speak to consumer spending, what we might be looking forward to.
Well, if the congressional package comes through and provides transfer payments, again, you're going to see another surge in consumption, but you're probably going to see some of that saved. It's really a function of job creation. If we see jobs rising through the beginning of 2021 and into the summer, and we're getting that percentage change from 1 year ago and really from the beginning of the coronavirus getting closer to zero, you're going to see consumption start to ratchet back up, and then you'll see taxable sales rise and a little bit more movement on the travel side. But we need those jobs to come back to really see a more complete trended growth in consumption.
Okay, thank you. And these questions and the answers and the presentation will be posted on the Kshaped Concepts website if you want to go back and check anything. Thank you again, Dr. Eiler, and KMA for hosting and sponsoring.
Thank you all for coming.